Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm your host, Dave Reed. At Mondoweiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. In this episode, Mondoweiss' U.S. correspondent Michael Arria updates us on some key stories he is tracking in his weekly politics newsletter, The Shift. After that, Michael speaks to Zoha Khalili, a staff attorney at Palestine Legal, about the organization's 2021 Year-in Review report. Michael, the top story in last week's Shift newsletter was the death of Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State and the first woman to ever hold that position.
Yeah, Madeleine Albright died recently. She was, of course, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State from 1997 until 2001. She was the first woman to ever hold that position. There's been a couple since her. And before that, from the first half of his presidency, she was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. In the newsletter, I covered something she said, which has, I think, a really interesting legacy. A lot of people were bringing it up on social media after she passed away. There was a very famous 60-minute segment in spring of 1996 where CBS took a hard, kind of concise look at the impact of the Clinton administration's sanctions on Iraq, particularly the impact that they were having on children in the country. And at that time, there was a UN Commission study that found, or that estimated up to perhaps 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a result of those sanctions. So Leslie Stahl, the host of 60 Minutes, or one of the correspondents, asked Albright pretty directly if she thought that the price was worth it.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died when in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it. It is a moral question, but the moral question is even a larger one. Don't we owe to the American people and to the American military and to the other countries in the region that this man not be a threat?
In the newsletter, I just kind of talked about the legacy of those remarks because they weren't really referenced in U.S. media much after the fact, but you know, they obviously made the rounds in other parts of the world, particularly the Middle East, where lots of people were aware of those comments. And people might remember that shortly after September 11th, bin Laden actually referenced, I think it was less than a month after, put out a video in which he referenced Iraqi children dying from the sanctions. I mean, that was a consistent staple of his recruitment videos and others. So they really had this kind of legacy that wasn't really reflected in the U.S. media at all. I found a FAIR piece from November 2001 when I wrote the newsletter, which took a look in the wake of September 11th, how many times that 60 Minutes interview had been referenced. And the author of the piece was only able to find one op-ed, I believe in the Orange County Register, that mentioned it. So I talked about that. And I also talked about this moment later in the presidency, at which point I believe she was already Secretary of State, where her and a bunch of other a couple other Clinton administration figures showed up at Ohio State University to make a case really for confrontation with Saddam Hussein. And this is something that I think her death should kind of highlight for people that, you know, some people might view the Clinton years as kind of this gap between the Gulf War and, you know, the second Bush's war in Iraq. But in actuality, if you look at the Clinton years, of course, you know, they continually bombed Iraq. There were these sanctions which killed thousands of people. And they also, you know, developed this policy for attacking Iraq. They passed, or Clinton signed legislation that basically made regime change policy official. This is, you know, years before the Bush administration. So a lot of the groundwork for what happens under Bush and the attack on Iraq and the invasion is, you know, those seeds are really planted during the Clinton years. So anyway, she was confronted at this event, which aired on CNN. And, you know, this is before everybody had like a camera in their back pocket. So it's kind of hard to, you know, you just didn't see stuff like this much, especially on national television where politicians had to field like really difficult questions. So there's a 22-year-old substitute teacher at the time, a guy named John Strange, who gets up and basically asks, to paraphrase, just asks Albright directly.
Yes, I have a question for Secretary Albright. Why bomb Iraq when other countries have committed similar violations? Turkey, for example. Can I finish? For example, Turkey has bombed Kurdish citizens. Saudi Arabia has tortured political and religious dissidents. Why does the U.S. apply different standards of justice to these countries?
Let me say that when there are problems such as you have described, we point them out and make very clear our opposition to them. But there is no one that has done to his people or to his neighbors what Saddam Hussein has done, or what he is thinking about doing. I am very...
About Indonesia. Well, you've turned my microphone off.
That Saddam Hussein has produced weapons of mass destruction, which he's clearly not collecting for his own personal pleasure, but in order to use, and therefore he is qualitatively and quantitatively different from every brutal dictator that has appeared recently, and we are very concerned about him specifically and what his plans might be.
Thank you. My microphone is off. There we are. What do you have to say about dictators of countries like Indonesia, who we sell weapons to, yet they are slaughtering people in East Timor? What do you have to say about Israel, who is slaughtering Palestinians, who impose martial law? What do you have to say about that? Those are our allies. Why do we sell weapons to these countries? Why do we support them? Why do we bomb Iraq when it commits similar problems?
There are various examples of things that are not right in this world, and the United States is trying... I really am surprised that people feel that it is necessary to defend the rights of Saddam Hussein, when what we ought to be thinking about is how to make sure that he does not use weapons of mass destruction.
I'd like to...
shouting, just a moment.
I'm not defending him in the least. What I am saying is that there needs to be consistent application of U.S. foreign policy. We cannot support people who are committing the same violations because they are political allies. That is not acceptable. We cannot violate UN resolutions when it is convenient to us. You're not answering my question, Madam Albright.
You study carefully what American foreign policy is, what we have said exactly about the cases that you have mentioned. Every one of them have been pointed out. Every one of them we have clearly stated our policy on. And if you would like, as a former professor, I would be delighted to spend 50 minutes with you describing exactly what we are doing on those subjects.
Secretary.
It's all the beats that we'd see years later, which kind of became associated with the Bush administration. Of course, regime. These words like regime change, these allegations of weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be completely false. And that old bit that the Bush administration loved to roll out, which is if you oppose the war on terror, obviously you're not patriotic or you're defending Saddam Hussein. So. There was a lot of laudatory press, obviously, when she died, as these things generally go, and a lot of op-eds kind of celebrating her. And of course, she was a historic figure in many ways, but that part of her legacy obviously wasn't really covered in the mainstream media at all. So, yeah, the first part of the newsletter last week was about that.
You pointed out on Twitter that the person putting those hard questions to Albright at the Ohio State event was John Strange, a former writer at the magazine Punk Planet.
Oh, yeah. Shout out to Punk Planet. A fan.
We'll include a link to the Punk Planet archives in the show notes for those listeners who aren't familiar with that legendary magazine. The Middle East Studies Association overwhelmingly passed a BDS resolution recently. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. This is, for people who don't know the Middle East Association, I believe they've existed since 1966. They've been around for a long time. People might remember that in the winter, we covered the fact that they had voted overwhelmingly to move forward with a BDS resolution vote. And that took place, I believe people sent in their votes electronically from the end of January through mid-March. So as you mentioned, 80%, 768 to 167 voted in favor of it. On the group's website, the president, Eve Trout Powell, put out a statement where she said, "Our members have cast a clear vote to answer the call for solidarity from Palestinian scholars and students experiencing violations of their right to education and other human rights. Our board will work to honor the will of its members and ensure that the call for an academic boycott is upheld without undermining our commitment to the free exchange of ideas and scholarship." So pretty notable as we see more and more of these groups honoring the 2005 call from Palestinians for an academic boycott.
You also covered a letter from 50 Democratic members of the House of Representatives sent to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken demanding preventative action on Palestinian home demolitions.
Yeah, that's true. We don't see these every day, of course. 50 House members sent a letter to Secretary of State Blinken, like you said, calling on the Biden administration to intervene. 38 Palestinian homes on the verge of being destroyed. There's some interesting names on this list, I thought, not people that they're Mark Pocan, some people that maybe are associated with this issue sometimes, but people like David Price from North Carolina, Jamie Raskin from Maryland. So I thought it was pretty interesting. There's some interesting names on there. I could just read one small part here. It says, in 1949, as part of the armistice, this is from the letter, in 1949, as part of the armistice agreement between Israel and Jordan, residents who had resided in what became Israel were compelled to relocate to the Jordanian side of the Green Line. Israel captured this land in the 1967 war, and after occupying the West Bank, annexed roughly 1/3 of it. So that's pretty notable. We've seen more of these letters in recent years. It's an interesting development, certainly. We'll see if the Biden administration does anything in that regard, although it's very doubtful, obviously, based on their track record.
And lastly, there is more news about Jamal Bowman, the Democrat and squad member from New York, voting to support Iron Dome funding. Can you help us understand what's going on with Jamal Bowman?
I don't think I can personally. I mean, we talked a bit at the site about the fallout involving his membership in DSA, which has kind of spun in all kinds of additional directions now that the BDS working group was dechartered by DSA. We have multiple pieces on our site if people want to check them out. But maybe not. I'll try not to get into the weeds with that, but I would just say that the Iron Dome funding, the vote on Iron Dome funding that happened last year for that extra $1 billion, people might remember that was one of the major sticking points with the backlash to Bowman with DSA. The other one was the trip he took to Israel and Palestine with J Street, the liberal Zionist group. Bowman was one of the only House members to vote against the increased militarization and incarceration spending in that last appropriation spending bill, which just passed, I believe, last week, if not the week before. He put out a statement, though, that made it clear that he would have voted for the Iron Dome funding if it had been cleaved from the rest of the bill. So he put out the statement, and also he would have voted for military aid to Ukraine. So he put out a statement where he said, "There were elements of the defense spending section that if voted on separately, I would have supported, including additional military aid to Ukraine and funding for the Iron Dome, which I have already voted for once and I fully support." And then he just goes on to say that the defense and incarceration package is bloated, that we have to cut back on military spending. But I thought that was pretty notable because I'm not really sure what the function was other than to go out of his way to point out, to remind everybody that he supports Iron Dome funding and signal that his vote against that part of the budget, which was obviously a good vote, was not done for anything to do with Israel or Palestine, certainly.
Do you think his vote here is a bit of pre-election positioning? I
mean, it could be, but remember, Bowman just got redistricted too, in a situation where it seems like he took his name off or dropped his support of that bill endorsing the Abraham Accords recently. And a lot of people said that they thought the reason he did that is because his district had shifted and he was able to kind of make these decisions now that he didn't have as many pro-Israel constituents. So I'm not sure. I mean, it could just be something to point to maybe in his reelection campaign. But I believe Bowman, if I have this correctly, he had that one Democratic challenger that didn't seem very challenging. And I believe that guy just ended his campaign like a week ago, right? So I'm not sure who he's really, obviously a very heavily Democratic district. There's no chance of a Republican candidate winning. So I'm not entirely sure what his motivations were.
If you're interested in keeping up to date with the changing landscape of U.S. politics around Palestine, visit our site to subscribe to Michael's weekly newsletter, The Shift. It's free to subscribe, and it's published every Thursday afternoon. Next, we're going to hear an interview Michael did with Zoha Khalili, a staff attorney at Palestine Legal, about their 2021 Gear in Review report.
Okay, so to start, in the recent report from Palestine Legal, it says there was a 31% increase of incidents responded to from 2020, an increase from 2020, and a 13% increase from pre-pandemic numbers in 2019. I was wondering what you attribute those increases to. Some of them obviously stem from the pandemic, but what would you attribute those to beyond the pandemic, potentially?
I mean, it's hard for me to know for sure, but I imagine that there's a variety of factors that are coming into play here. So one of them, I think, is just the egregiousness of the actions of the Israeli government, and the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and the attacks on Gaza that took place in the spring of 2020. I think really. Of 2021, I think really resulted in a lot of mobilization and a lot of people coming into the movement because they're taking place, in the era of social media. There's been live on the ground reporting about what's going on. And I think it's resulting in a lot of people becoming more aware and really getting engaged in activism. And as there are more people engaging in activism, there are more people signing on to solidarity statements, speaking out about Palestine. We're seeing more attacks on them because the Israeli government and its allies are really getting desperate to try to, stem the growth of public awareness in this sphere. The other thing, which is related to the pandemic, is that in 2020, a lot of the activism was taking place online, and people were having maybe smaller scale, more private events where they're less likely to face backlash and where there aren't the same gatekeepers like universities controlling whether or not they can have events. But these are really taking place in more private spaces and resulting in a lot of education that is taking place in more like sympathetic spaces. And as these people are getting educated and now, back to being able to have events in person, I think we're seeing just a serious growth in Palestine activism on and off campus. And it's still early in March. And so I'm not sure how Israeli Awareness Week is going to be going on campus this year, but I am expecting there to be a huge increase in just the number of events that people are holding and in the turnout to those events, but we'll see.
There was at least 34 legislative attempts to silence Palestinian rights in 2021, obviously anti-BDS laws throughout the country. I thought it was notable that only 4 passed, according to the report. There's a lot of coverage of these attempts to kind of stifle dissent and silence Palestinian rights. But I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about the resistance to these kinds of measures and laws and what strategies you found have been effective at actually combating them.
Yeah, I think one thing that I found really interesting, there was this new documentary that came out called Boycott, talking about these laws. And there is a scene where the filmmaker is talking to a legislator, and it's a Democratic legislator who says something about how, if he knew what these laws were about, he never would have voted for it in the first place. And I think really the most effective thing people can do is to show up to hearings on these laws and to talk about what the laws actually say. Because I think that with a lot of the legislators that are voting for them, and you see broad bipartisan support for some of these measures, they don't know what they're voting for, and they might think, they stand with Israel, and they don't really realize that they are making an exception for Israel that we never would make for even the United States. Like, there aren't laws that say that you can't boycott the United States. And I imagine that these legislators would be a lot more loyal to the United States if given the option of choosing whether there needs to be a law that protects the United States from boycotts versus a law that protects Israel from boycotts. But they just, they hear BDS, and that in their minds sounds like something nefarious, because it's been portrayed as something nefarious by Israel's PR machine. But I think just letting people know what BDS is about and explaining and, building alliances with, potential partners in these spaces. So the ACLU has been really effective in elucidating the free speech impacts and the unconstitutionality of these laws and challenging them in court. And I think that, even though they are unwilling to take a stance on Palestine, that building partnerships with these free speech groups in these strategic spaces, I think has also been very effective, because I think a lot of the legislators don't want to be seen as running afoul of the Constitution and of the way it's being interpreted by the ACLU.
Most of these reported incidents occur on campuses, and there's been an amazing amount of coverage and discourse and debate about what's called campus free speech in the mainstream. But I'm struck by kind of the disconnect here between mainstream analysis of this phenomenon and what's actually happening to, the opinions of Palestinians or, advocacy for Palestine. It seems that Palestinians who are censored are losing their jobs on campuses. That those kind of stories don't really permeate all these debates about cancel culture, or what's called cancel culture. Can you talk a little bit about that disconnect and just that state of affairs, the fact that these things don't really ever enter that discourse, despite the fact that there's so much of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just fundamental to the idea of mainstream coverage of cancel culture. I think it's just really self-contradictory of the idea that you're being canceled, but then you're also publishing an opinion piece in the largest newspaper in the country, talking about the way that you're being silenced and that you're afraid to speak out on campus. Yeah, and I think it's just a lot of times we're seeing, the right wing adopt a lot of language and really weaponize a lot of language that has been used to try to describe the way that progressives and activists are being targeted, and to really try to portray themselves as being the victims. And I think there is a fundamental disconnect between this idea of people being able to speak out and not being restricted by the people in power. So the First Amendment is meant to prevent the government from restricting our speech. And we have similar principles where we expect that, for example, Facebook will not be censoring people when it is acting as this public space where people are engaging in most of their discourse, or other social media companies. I guess maybe Facebook is not that right now. But I think, we have this expectation that people in positions of authority will not be silencing dissent. And that's a really fundamental principle for our society. But I think people tend to confuse that with not facing consequences for your actions. And so, when people are saying things that are racist, oftentimes people will, respond to that and say that, for example, they don't want racist professors on campus. They don't want professors that are going to say things that will marginalize particular students in class. And they don't want their classmates to be saying things that are racist. And, having those consequences from their peers, I think, is something that is beneficial. We want our people to face accountability in society. And that's something that, is being portrayed as cancel culture. And so you then see the people in power who then identify with the racism that those individuals are engaging in, saying it's unfair that this, white man is not being allowed to say racist things. And really, because they identify with that, then they will amplify those voices. But you're not seeing people who are having their words manipulated by people who have more power. So students who, might be talking about their family members having their homes destroyed, and then a site like Canary Mission will then say, the homes that were destroyed, they were affiliated with Hamas somehow. And so the student who now is talking about homes being destroyed is defending Hamas. And so we're going to call them terrorists. And then whenever you type their name into Google, the first thing that comes up is this person is supporting terrorists. And that can be devastating for people who are struggling to find a job and whose employers first see that listed as this name associated with terrorists. And they have oftentimes people who are Arab Muslim immigrants active in the movement will have fairly unique names. And so Canary Mission is really able to effectively target them. And, that causes people to be afraid to engage in activism and really impacts the movement. But I think, when you are literally being canceled, you're a lot less able to talk about that and a lot less able to get that mainstream attention to that issue. It's something that we're trying to draw more attention to. I imagine it's something that Mondoweiss is trying to draw more attention to. But, we're not there yet. We don't, I think, have the same audience that something like the New York Times would when they're spreading this message.
In addition to these incidents of censorship, there's also some big legal victories that are cited throughout the report, particularly these harassing lawsuits that were filed, which ended up being dismissed. Can you talk about the idea of harassing lawsuits if people maybe don't know what those are, and maybe mention some of those cases briefly?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the legal victories, because our whole legal system essentially is designed to entrench people who are in power and to preserve that power. And the idea that, even when these pro-Israel groups are trying to use these mechanisms that were designed to, serve the interests of people that are aligned with them, they still fail it's very exciting for me to see as an attorney. And so this is an issue that is broader than Palestine. Oftentimes, people who have the time and the money to go to court to silence people can be effective in, exhausting activists who are trying to speak out on a wide variety of issues. And it's something that is so widespread that there's been a lot of laws that have been passed in, I think, about half of states that create mechanisms for people to throw out lawsuits. Because you don't have to have an effective legal claim in order to go to court. You essentially just need to have the time and the money to file the papers. And if someone doesn't respond to you going to court, the person that you're suing might lose by default. And so some activist who doesn't have an attorney to respond or who can't afford to hire someone to respond to a lawsuit, might lose on a case, even though there is absolutely no merit to it. And so in these cases that we talk about in our report, these have been people who did find attorneys who were able to represent them, and were able to, defeat these lawsuits that were making absolutely baseless claims. And so one of them that was in California was an activist whose name is Zoha Khalili, and she had posted something on Facebook, a photo, a promotional photo that the Israeli Defense Forces had used of one of their soldiers. And she had posted that alongside Palestinian medic, sorry, I think Razan, what is her name? Razan and Najjar. And so Razan had been killed during the Great Return March, and while she was providing medical services. And I think Zoha was just trying to highlight the contrast between, what young Palestinians are doing in defending their people and what young Americans are doing in going to Israel to try to wage these offensive battles. And the Israeli soldier, or I guess ex-soldier now, no longer serving in the military, filed a lawsuit in California saying that Zoha had accused her of personally killing this Palestinian medic. And Zoha was able to find an attorney who represented her and push back and use these laws that have been enacted to try to help people fight back against these harassing lawsuits. And what that law meant was that really early on in the case, Zoha was able to file papers saying that this is absolutely baseless, and not only get the case thrown out without taking too much of her time, but also get her attorney fees paid for. And so the court approved, I think, nearly $50,000 in attorney fees for her attorney. So that the lawsuit didn't end up costing Zoha money, assuming that the person who sued her ends up paying up. I'm not sure if that has happened, but and then another case which actually is still ongoing because the group that lost has filed an appeal, and so the appeal is still pending. This was a much broader issue. It was a lawsuit by the Jewish National Fund against the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And they were essentially arguing that because the U.S. campaign has spoken out in support of the Great March of Return and has engaged in advocacy in support of that, that they are responsible for kites that were lit on fire and released from Gaza and had landed in forests that were planted by the Jewish National Fund to, cover up Palestinian villages that were destroyed by Israel in its founding, using non-native trees that are incredibly flammable. But there had been some fires that apparently, according to this lawsuit, had resulted from the Great March of Return, and somehow they wanted to accuse the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights of engaging in terrorism for somehow being connected with these fires. The court found these claims absolutely baseless and threw them out, but the Jewish National Fund is still pushing and has appealed to the next highest court to try to get their lawsuit reinstated. And then there was a lawsuit, and one thing I should note is that amazing attorneys that are working on these lawsuits, not Palestine Legal, so we're not trying to take credit for their work. There was a lawsuit that we were involved in, and this one was on behalf of a group of anonymous presenters who spoke at the 2018 National Students for Justice in Palestine Conference. And, because of the surveillance that the host university was engaging in, demanding that the students turn over the names of all of the speakers so that, this was at the University of California, Los Angeles, so that UCLA's police could then check to see if these people are terrorists or threats, which, I don't think speakers in workshops at other conferences have been required to do, based off my conversations with students. But there was this intense scrutiny of the conference and, claims that the conference was promoting terrorism and anti-Semitism. And so, the security forces within the university collected a lot of information about the conference. And then a right-wing Zionist attorney said, I want access to that information, even though the conference was closed and, people took a lot of steps to ensure that it was a safe space that people felt comfortable participating in and, didn't think that they would have necessarily their names and information leaked as a result of that conference. So UCLA, because students had actually talked to them about these threats in advance, they understood that they should not be turning over that information to the Zionist attorney, which he was trying to pursue under California's public records laws. So we have laws that try to ensure government transparency. And if you're asking for records from a public institution, like the University of California, generally speaking, they would have to turn over those records unless there's some kind of exception. But here, UCLA understood that there is an exception in a situation where, student privacy is at risk. And so they didn't turn over the records. The right-wing Zionist attorney tried to sue them, and we intervened and working on the same side as UCLA to try to protect the privacy of the students and activists that spoke at the conference. And we were successful in preventing the court from forcing UCLA to turn over those records.
And finally, one of the biggest stories of 2021, certainly the biggest activist story at our site, was Ben & Jerry's announcing they were going to stop their business in illegal settlements in Palestine. I should point out before I ask this question that that hasn't actually happened. And they've made it clear that they're not pulling out of Israel entirely. They announced the other day that they're kind of recalibrating their relationship, and activists are continuing to demand that they pull out altogether. But having said that, that decision nonetheless led to a wave of hysterical backlash, but also governors divesting from their parent company, Unilever, legal maneuvering, lawsuits. I'm just wondering what you make of this from your perspective at Palestine Legal, and what should people be paying attention to as they follow this story over the coming months?
Yeah, I mean, I think you pointed out the most important thing, which is to actually watch and see whether Ben & Jerry's does what they claimed. So it does seem like, if Ben & Jerry's wants to draw a line between illegal settlements and the rest of the occupation of Palestinian lands, that is unlikely to be successful under Israeli law, that, Israel has a big commitment to treating these illegal settlements as part of Israel itself, and preventing companies from being able to operate within Israel without operating within illegal settlements. And so I think it's just, one thing is that, there is a victory that activists won, but I think there's going to be more work to do to ensure that victory actually has an impact on the ground. With the large number of states that try to invoke their anti-boycott laws to punish Ben & Jerry's and Unilever, it was interesting to see that actually there are states whose laws just had no applicability here, and now they're trying to amend their laws to actually get them to apply to Unilever. And I'm curious to see how that plays out, especially because of all the boycotts that are now taking place against Ukraine. And it's been something that we've seen a lot of people highlight, that the hypocrisy of, engaging in a cultural boycott of Russia, and not, the same people maybe that are engaging in that boycott and pushing for that boycott are trying to treat a boycott of Israel as being something dangerous and harmful. And so I think it's just really interesting to look at the ways that pro-Israel groups have been trying to portray just like the fluctuations in the market and, Unilever's decisions around corporate restructuring as being somehow driven by this, even though it's really, I imagine, just a drop in the bucket of Unilever's revenues. And so I think just it really requires a long-term perspective on how this plays out. I do think it is very chilling for other companies, and maybe might make them less susceptible to living up to their social justice values, just to see the huge amount of backlash that Ben & Jerry's and Unilever have faced. But I do think that, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. One thing that I think would be really interesting to see is, if these laws, and particularly, I think a lot of the laws that are being invoked here are not the same laws that have been challenged in court. So like there is a branch of anti-boycott laws that, require people who are entering into contracts with the state to pledge that they're not going to boycott Israel. But there is a whole other branch of laws that have to do with the companies that states are investing in. And those are the ones that are primarily being invoked here, to say that like state pension funds, for example, shouldn't be invested in Unilever. Those laws really haven't been challenged in court because there haven't been people who have been, directly impacted by them. And so, there's one possibility that Unilever absolutely won't be impacted by these divestments because of the way that markets work, and other people might want to invest in Unilever because of, the broad range of products it makes and the profits that it's bringing in as a result of that. But, if it does have a material impact that can be traced to these divestments, Unilever would then be potentially in a position to challenge these laws. And, because we've never seen that happen, I think it would be really interesting to potentially might result in these anti-boycott laws and this strategy that not only is impacting people who support Palestinian rights, but is impacting a broad range of other social movements, because they're serving as a model for example, states are considering now laws against investing in companies that divest from weapons manufacturers, for example, or oil and gas companies. And so it could, the fact that Ben & Jerry's did this could potentially be a test case that results in all of these laws getting overturned if there is a will on the part of Unilever to push back on these moves, and if there is a material impact that takes place in terms of their bottom line, which again is really unclear. I think it's the insane fluctuations of the markets, especially right now. I think it's really impossible to know, but I think that from a long-term perspective, it might be easier to tell. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for chatting with us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to talk.
Thanks for listening to our show, a production of Mondoweiss.net. The music is from Sound of Picture. Visit our site to sign up for free daily and weekly newsletters on Palestine, Israel, and related U.S. politics. If you're enjoying our podcast, please consider becoming a donor by visiting Mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication, and every donation of any amount helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find our show.